Okay, one of the things that might be helpful is to sort of contrast it with a little bit that I know about what Wilson is like now. And as we talked about a few minutes ago, one of the things that's very different is that the school really was not very diverse. It was mainly white. I had a graduating class of probably between 400 and 425 kids, and there was one black student in the entire class, a young man, and I can't even remember his name. Another thing that was very different then as opposed to now is that if you were a family that lived in the Wilson School District, you sent your kids to Wilson. Very few families sent their kids to private school, as is the case now, because Wilson was considered a very good school academically and was rated very high nationally. I don't know whether that's still the case or not. So in my neighborhood, for example, kids went to Wilson. They didn't go to Friends, and they didn't go to St. Albans and National Cathedral and Georgetown Day, etc. They went to Wilson. The kids who went to private school, by and large, were kids who had special problems that necessitated their being in smaller classes or getting more individual attention in school, or maybe they had a family that had gone to one of these private schools for years. But in general, Wilson was the neighborhood school, and that's where everybody sent their kids. Another thing that I've noticed in hearing kids talk about Wilson, hearing you talk about Wilson, 3 choirs, one choir. Stagecraft, are you kidding? Theater classes, are you kidding? There was a group of people who did theater, but that was totally extracurricular. The school focused very much on hardline academic subjects. I mean, it was history, it was math, it was English, it was foreign languages, etc. And there were not a lot of the, what I would consider softer subjects that I now see taught in high schools and taught at Wilson. The plant was obviously much older. I don't know whether you came to Wilson before it was renovated, but it was a very old building. I think it had been built in the 30s, and at the time I went, I don't think a lot had been done to it. And as a matter of fact, I went back there, I guess it was about 5 or 10 years ago. A friend of mine was volunteering there. I walked in the front door, and it looked exactly the way it looked when I graduated. I mean, it looked like the place hadn't even been painted, but the physical plant was kind of a mess. In terms of what your day was like, you would initially report to a homeroom. Do you still do that? That's interesting. Well, you would report to your homeroom every day, and you would be there for a very short amount of time. And I can't remember exactly what happened during homeroom. Maybe the teacher would take attendance just to make sure that everybody that was in that particular homeroom was there for the day. And if people were absent, then that would be reported to the front office. And then at some point, the bell would ring, and I can't remember exactly when that was. And you would go off to your first class, and of the people in your homeroom, would all go off to different classes because they were, some people would go to their English class, and some people would go to their math class or their history class, whatever their first class was during the day. And then every 45 or 50 minutes, the bell would ring again, and you would move on to another class. And then I think there were 2 or 3 lunch periods. You would have lunch, and then you do afternoon classes, and then there would be after school. There were all kinds of after school activities. I assume not terribly different from what you have today. There were sports, there were various kinds of clubs, etc. One of the things that may have distinguished the Wilson that I went to from the Wilson of today is that there was, at that time, what was known as an honors track, and you were put, if you were considered a person who could do well in honors classes, which were more rigorous than other classes, you were put in an honors track, and then you took all honors courses. You took honors English, honors math, honors history, etc. And that's what you did throughout your entire Wilson history. One of the things that they didn't have, which I understand Wilson has now, is they had no AP or IB courses. At the time I went to school, you could take advanced placement tests if you wanted to get credit for college, but there were no courses in the schools to prepare you for those, so you had to sort of prepare on your own and then just take the test. Let's see. you'll see this in your life, but shortly after you graduate from high school, you kind of move on. You know, you're in college, and then you get, you know, maybe you go to graduate school, then you get jobs, and high school becomes kind of a distant memory. And you have fond memories of it, and hopefully very positive memories, and you still perhaps hang around with some friends from high school, but high school it's the past. Yes, I was in the choir. At the time I went to Wilson, if you wanted to be in the choir, it was actually a class, and it met at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you showed up at 8 and for choir practice, and then they did a number of performances throughout the year. I don't remember the names of all my teachers at Wilson, but I do remember the name of the choir director. It was Dr. Wells, and she was just excellent. She was just an excellent musician, an excellent teacher, and being in choir was a lot of fun. I was the cartoonist for the paper, which is still called The Beacon. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did cartoons for that. I'm trying to remember what other groups I was in. I played some intramural sports. I played intramural volleyball. There was a Latin club. Back in the days when I was at Wilson, they actually offered Latin, which when I was in school, you started languages in junior high school. Do they still do that? Okay, so you had a choice between Latin and French. You didn't have the diversity of languages that you have now. And as I recall, those were your only choices. So I started with Latin at Deal and continued it through Wilson. When you got to Wilson, there was actually a Latin club that was run by the Latin teacher. And once a year, we'd have a big Latin banquet, and everybody would turn up in togas, and there would be there would be slaves serving dishes and various other things. It was really a lot of fun. Let me see what else. I'm sure if I think about it some more, I can kind of remember it. One of the things that's sort of interesting, and I may have this wrong, but in the 21st century, I sense that the reason a lot of kids sign up for extracurricular activities is not necessarily because they're particularly interested in them, but to basically fill out their resume for college. And I never saw that when I was going to school. I mean, if people got involved in some after-school activity, it was because generally they were really interested in doing it. And I think that really may have changed the culture of those after-school activities and the organizations and everything else. Oh, that's another thing I did. I don't know whether they still have it. Do they have Girls State and Boys State? I only vaguely remember it, but it was a program that brought together kids from schools all over the district and ultimately all over the United States, and they got together in some type of organization that was trying to show them how government worked. And you would sort of represent your school in this sort of quasi-government organization. I think it lasted for, I can't remember, a few days or a week or something. Generally for me, high school was a very positive experience. I had, by and large, excellent teachers. I had very nice friends. I did well. So I don't really remember anything that stands out. I don't remember any, horribly negative experiences. So it's just very difficult for me to talk about it. And again, it was almost 50 years ago. So
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you talk, I guess, a little bit about like the culture of the school, like what was dating like, or what was, do you know any, like, what was the fashion or any of the slang or anything of that, like, from I mean, maybe you don't remember it, but just, it's kind of cool to, like, see how that's changed, over time, because I'm sure the slang you had is far different from what we use now,
There were certainly no four-letter words. I mean, if anybody so much as said hell or damn, you were in big trouble in class. There was a very strict dress code, which fortunately is no longer. Women did not wear pants to school. I mean, if you wore pants because it was 0 degrees out, you needed to take them off and put them in your locker before you went into the classroom. And any skirts that you wore had to touch the ground. If you got down on your knees, they couldn't be.
Oh, so they had to be like knee length at least.
Basically knee length. That's exactly right. Boys were not allowed to wear, as I recall, white T-shirts. They could wear T-shirts of any other color. There were some other little crazy rules about whether you could wear heels or not. I don't think you could wear tennis shoes. I think you had to wear flats, or some other, or maybe Oxfords were okay. There were a lot of dress code requirements that, you know, in the 21st century looked really, really, really old-fashioned. There were, as I'm sure is the case today, there were cliques, you know, groups of people who got together. There were the jocks and the brains and the very social people, and I'm sure that's true today. You know, you have your geeks and various other classes of people. Dating, I don't know whether dating was different or, you know, pretty much the same. There were people who did a lot of dating. There were people who didn't do very much dating. There were other people who dated more in groups. You know, they ran around with their group, and sometimes the groups would be, you know, both boys and girls. Sometimes it's just a, you know, group of girls. There were no, you know, I think there were actually a couple of sororities at Wilson when I was there. Yeah.
There aren't anymore, but one of the other people I interviewed was talking.
That was another social. That was another social unit. I'm trying to think. I don't think there were any fraternities, but there might have been. I'm trying to think what other social stuff there was. Slang, they're obviously putting aside 4-letter words. There were a lot of slang expressions that, you know, were used in the 50s and 60s that you don't hear anymore. They're very culturally oriented, and if you hear people say them, you can tell they came from that generation because they're simply not used today. And it's interesting for me because I hear slang expressions in 2013, and I have no idea what they mean. Because they're just from a different generation. Obviously, no technology. You know, no computers, no iPads, no iPhones. Nobody had phones. I mean, you know, you had a phone at home, and that was it. So that was very, very different. Some of the other stuff. Teaching methods, obviously, very different. Because again, part of that's driven by technology. You didn't have a lot of the technological aids that you had. The way you did research was very different. You did research in a library with books. Teachers had, I think, more limited resources for teaching than they have today. On the other hand, I think teaching was easier back in the 60s than it is in 2013 for a whole bunch of reasons. I think it's, for teachers, they're both pluses and minuses when you compare the two time periods.
Okay. Sorry, I just really, I'm like, oh man, this is so interesting. So
it's basically, you know, it's 50 years ago.
Right.
But it is interesting because we're talking about the same schools. You know,
right.
You and I.
It's
not like I went to a school in Iowa and you went to a school in Washington, D.C.
Right. It's a very
we went to the same school in
time.
Washington, D.C., but it has changed significantly in the last 50 years.
I used to have this picture book that I read, you know, so much when I was little, and it's a street through time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like a street, and it starts with the like Neanderthals or whatever, and kind of works up to the modern day, like through like the Roman, you know, and it's kind of a similar, obviously not quite as drastic, but it's just very like
another very important change.
Mm-hmm.
Metal detectors.
Oh yeah.
Security? Are you kidding? No, we had none of that. Wasn't a problem. absolutely wasn't a problem. Kids bringing, weapons or knives or something like that into school just wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's very upsetting to me to go back to my old high school and see stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's it's part of being in a city high school in 2013. That's just something that that you have to worry about.
It definitely is. I think my flashcard only supports like 22 minutes of
That's fine. If
footage
you
or
have to
something.
change, if you have
So,
to change your memory card, that's
but I
fine.
mean, I kind of, do you have any, like, things specifically that, I guess, did you take anything from Wilson into college or the rest of your life? I mean, I know you said that you kind of left high school behind you, but did you, unintentionally, or was there anything where you're like, oh, this is something that I've picked up from high school and kind of just had, like a habit or anything like that, sort of?
Not really. I mean, I hope Wilson is still doing this, but when I went to Wilson prepared me well for college. I went to a demanding college, as many of my many Wilson students did. And in terms of developing good, analytical and critical thinking skills and good writing skills and communication skills, yeah, Wilson prepared me for high school. And it was obvious, for college. And when I got to college, it was obvious that some kids in my college had gone to high schools that had not prepared them very well. I mean, they had managed to get into college, but their high schools had not done as good a job as Wilson. So in terms of providing a good, solid academic education, and providing a love of learning, particularly the love of reading and of academics. I credit a lot of that to Wilson, and also the other schools that I went to before then, to deal into elementary school as well. So I don't know whether the DC's public school system is doing that in the 21st century. I assume it is for some kids, but maybe not for all. And that is, at least to me as an adult, that is just an enormous gift that you carry with you for the rest of your life. I mean, for the rest of your life, to love to read, you were talking about how much you love learning, and you were talking quiz
bowl.
Yeah, quiz ball, or it's academic or whatever, but you love learning new things. That is wonderful. And if a high school can give you that, if your education can give you that love of learning, it's really wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, can you talk at all about the, like, not the culture of the school, but of the, I guess how outside events affected either the school, the atmosphere, like, a lot was going on in the 60s, like,
oh yeah,
did
no,
that...
I went downtown for the, for Martin Luther King's speech, in August of '63. And that was an incredible event. That was just an absolutely incredible event. And you could tell that things were, they were going to change in the United States, hopefully for the better. And that they would change in your lifetime. Another thing that was a very important event for people of my generation was the assassination of John Kennedy. And as it happened, the day he was assassinated we had a half day at school. I think they had a teachers meeting or something in the afternoon. So a bunch of us came up to Wilson. We were going to play softball in the afternoon because we had a free afternoon, and we were playing on one of the fields that was right next to the school. And someone had a car, and they had the car radio on, and that's how we all learned that Kennedy had been shot. And then ultimately they reported that he was dead. And the teachers were all in what was then the library, which was the third floor of Wilson. I think they subsequently made that into classroom space, but that used to be the library. And one of us went in, one of the people in my group, it wasn't me, went in to tell the teachers that the president was dead, and that they should lower the flag to half-mast. And that was something you just never forget, and particularly being in Washington, because that's where the funeral was and everything else. And that was an enormous change. And then as you probably know, all the civil rights legislation, which...
Okay, so
I was just saying that the major civil rights legislation in the United States was passed in 1964, and you would read about it in the paper. And I think people who thought about it knew that this was going to bring about some big changes in the United States. But I don't think anybody had any idea how significant those would be at the time. And we've all benefited from those.
It's just like, whoa. I guess it's just so weird because the Kennedy assassination was like 10 days after my dad was born. So it was very yeah.
Wow.
It was like the end of November, right? And my dad was born the 14th.
Absolutely. Right, yeah. They celebrate the 50th anniversary this year.
Right. My dad turned 50 this year, so it's very affecting different people. And my grandparents are Irish, and so they...
Oh, I'm sure they really related to the Kennedys. Yeah.
Should hear my dad talks stories about growing up, with his parents saying, "Oh, the Kennedys would never eat with bad table manners or whatever." We were talking about this at Thanksgiving, and my grandmother's like, "I never told stories like that." All there's 5 of my dad and 4 siblings, and they're all like, "Yes, you did!"
Yeah.
So it's interesting how different events that affected everybody, how that kind of played out.
When you're in your very impressionable teens. And people have to understand what happened before Kennedy took office. The president before that was Dwight Eisenhower, was sort of like your grandfather, and Mamie Eisenhower was sort of like your grandmother, and they were fine. And then along comes Jack Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy and their 2 kids, and he is charming and very compelling, and he gives an inauguration speech that just fires you up. When you're 15 or 16 years old, and you want to do things with your life, and you want to make a difference. And so when he was killed, that was just devastating for people of my generation, and I think even for our parents. I think that they got very upset, but people of my generation, because he was. He represented someone who really believed in the future and really believed in the power of change and your ability to affect government and to make the world better. And so when he was shot, that was just really terrible, really terrible.
Yeah.
Fortunately, not during the high school period, but then when all of us went on to college, then there was the Vietnam War, and that was a whole nother set of very difficult political issues to deal with. You had friends who were being drafted and being killed in a war that within a very short amount of time most people thought was not a very good idea. Then you got involved in protests to try and stop it. And, it was the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, it was just a very tumultuous period. On the other hand, I would never trade having lived through that, because I think I learned a lot.
Yeah, you definitely have perspectives that
Right.
I don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just, being a woman and seeing what's happened in terms of women's rights and women's ability to progress in the workplace and things like that from the 60s here until 2013. That has changed enormously.
That kind of leads me to my next question, which is, what was it like being a girl in high school in the 60s? Were the odds stacked against you? I've stories of people, their teachers telling them they're never going to be able to do anything with their lives because they're girls. How did your experience as a girl, how did that affect your high school experience?
I actually, because I had some great women teachers, never was told I couldn't do anything. I was never told that by my teachers. My teachers, they encouraged you to do whatever you wanted to do. They encouraged you to do well. They encouraged you to succeed. Go on to college. Do whatever you wanted to do. And it's really when you got into college, when you started applying for jobs, and when you got into grad school, that you began to run into some of those barriers, which they're not as bad as they used to be, but they're still there, and they're much more subtle. I think women of today need to be much more alert to the subtlety of some of the discrimination that goes against women. It's it's all gone kind of underground. It's much more subtle than it used to be. But there is, I think, much less of it also.
Okay, so I guess just kind of do you have any general like last statements that you have to say about Wilson, or kind of like, you know, what you know about it now versus, I mean, you pretty much already covered what you know about it now and how it was then, but kind of any, I guess, closing statements that you may or may not have. Just kind of, you know.
No. Well, as I said, they're fuzzy, but I do have very fond memories of Wilson, and I just hope it's serving the people of the Wilson community in 2013 as well as it served me in the early 60s, which is when I went there. It's a great place to get an education with some wonderful teachers, and as I said, something that really, in addition to the rest of my education, set a sort of foundation for learning and love of learning and academics that has just lasted my entire life.
Okay, awesome.
Okay,
Thank you
good.
so much.